Alright, good morning students. We're here and we're talking about different forms of a conditional statement. So we have our if-then statements, we have if hypothesis, then conclusion. Well, there's other forms we can put a conditional statement in, and there's a lot of details we're going to talk about, a lot of cool things. So it's like saying the same thing but different. Alright, and there's going to be several forms, so it's important that we know which one's which. So the first one is converse. Alright, so to write the converse of a conditional statement, exchange the hypothesis and conclusion. Alright, so let's just dive into it. Reading the stuff we already learned. So, conditional statement, if hypothesis, then conclusion. And we have symbolically, if P, then Q. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to do this. We're going to do if conclusion, then hypothesis. So we're literally swapping the order. Alright, so if Q, then P. So here's an example, an actual, real life example. We have a conditional statement. If two angles are supplementary, then they add to 180 degrees. Alright, so our hypothesis, so we just don't blindly swap the order. We use a little logic. I know this isn't a English class, but we want to try our best to make it sound grammatically correct. Notice how our supplementary in the converse, that's going to be in the conclusion, that's going to be in the end. So my statement got a little cut off and had to bounce to the other part of the page. But anyways, add to 180, add to 180. So then the converse of that is if two angles add to 180, then they are supplementary. So conditional statement, if two angles are supplementary, then they add to 180 degrees. Converse of the statement, if two angles add to 180 degrees, then they are supplementary. And let's think about, are these true? Well, this first statement, this conditional statement, this is true. If two angles are supplementary, then they add to 180 degrees. We learned that in Unit 1. We already know that. What about if we swap the order? If two angles add to 180 degrees, then they are supplementary. Well, that's also true. We learned that in Unit 1. So this is very interesting. Alright, I had a statement, I swapped the order, and it was still true. Alright, that's pretty cool right there. Alright, so let's do more exercises, alright? We're going to write the following statements as conditional statements and determine if the statement is true or not. Then we'll write the converse of the statement and determine if that statement is true or false, or true or not. So if two angles are vertical, then they are congruent. That's true. Remember, we even have the vertical angle congruence theorem. Alright, so then the converse is if two angles are congruent, then they are vertical. So for the next few days, we're basically writing sentences. Alright, so you might want to get good at typing, or you might just like writing, whatever that may be. So again, to emphasize, are vertical, swap to the end. Are congruent, swap to the front. Alright, so we're swapping the order, we're swapping the hypothesis and conclusion. Now, is this statement true? If two angles are congruent, then they are vertical. Let me think. I can have a right angle chilling over here and a right angle chilling over here. These two right angles are congruent, but they're not vertical. They're just right angles floating in space. So this is false. Wow, interesting. So now I've seen a case where if I swap the order, the statement's no longer true. I'm going to give you a hint. There's going to be a pattern that forms. It's going to take a while to discover that pattern, though, so just stay seated and stay tuned. Alright? So, here's another one. If an angle measure is obtuse, then its measure is 108 degrees. Well, that's false. If it's obtuse, it can be 108 degrees, but it could be 109 degrees. It could be 110 degrees. It could be 111 degrees, so on and so forth, all right? So just because it's obtuse doesn't mean it specifically has to be 108. That's not the definition. Now, we're going to do the converse. If an angle measure is 108 degrees, then it is obtuse. Alright, and let's take a peek at this one. Obtuse went to the back. Measure 108 degrees went to the front. So that's the converse. This one is true. Alright, if it's 108, by definition, it has to be obtuse. Alright, so just one little thing. Converse. You swap order. Students like to say, think about swapping order of your Converse shoes. This is what they tell me. This is what they say. This helps them remember. You have Converse shoes, you put them on the wrong feet. Converse of a conditional statement, you're swapping the order. Alright, however you can remember, you might have a better way. You might like this way. You might think this way was the greatest way of all time. Whatever helps you. Alright, so that's number one, converse. Number two, inverse. Alright, to write the inverse of a conditional statement, you're going to negate both the hypothesis and conclusion. Alright, so the order stays the same. I'm going to write that. Order stays the same. Alright, and then how do I remember inverse? I know I'm bad at spelling, but I'm not this bad, but inverse. So think of inverse. Sounds like it starts with the letter N. I know it doesn't. Think about negate. Or not. Okay, that's what negate means. You're just putting not in front of a statement. Or removing a not if it exists. Anywho, if hypothesis, then conclusion. That's our conditional statement. If P, then Q. Alright. Then we have the converse, where the hypothesis is in the back and the conclusion's in the front. That's what we just did. Now, the new notation, notice how hypothesis stays in the front, conclusions in the back. However, we now have this not. We write not, oops, or we have the squiggly line. Alright. So this squiggly line, or you might see this, those means not. Those are just notation for not. Alright, so here's an example. If two angles are supplementary, then they add to 180 degrees. For fun, we already said, well, that's true. We know that to be true. Inverse statement, if two angles are not supplementary, then they do not add to 180 degrees. Well, that's also true. Supplementary angles add up to 180 degrees, so if they're not, they're going to add it to some kind of other number. And just to emphasize things, notice how order's the same. However, we put these nots in there. We put a not and a not. Both in the hypothesis and conclusion, we negated them. Alright? So we got the same two sentences. Again, there's going to be a pattern that ultimately forms. Might be a little too early to determine said pattern, but it does exist. If two angles are vertical, then they are congruent. We already said that's true. Inverse of this, we're going to stay in the same order. We're going to write if two angles are not vertical, then they are not congruent. And is that true or false? That's false. Alright, again, we can use the same counter example as before, where we got a right angle chilling over here, a right angle chilling over here. Alright, they're not vertical angles, but they're still congruent. And notice how we just put those knots right in there. Same order, just have the knots. If an angle measure is obtuse, then its measure is 108 degrees. We already said that's false. Now let's negate this. If an angle measure is not obtuse, then its measure is not 108 degrees. Alright, and this is actually true. Alright, why? If it's not obtuse, that means it's 90 degrees, or maybe an acute angle. So whatever that may be, it cannot be 108 degrees. Alright, so this is kind of interesting. We saw a case where it's true, true, up here, true, false, false, true. Seems chaotic. There is patterns going on. Stay tuned, and we're going to talk about contrapositive next.